stay curious. If we're curious about life and about people, that means that we're willing to learn, willing to see different ways of doing things. That life is always going to be interesting, and it's going to make us a better leader too.
Give up control to become a better leader. Easier said than done. But our guest here today, Peter Docker, is going to help us answer that question. Welcome, Peter.
Hello, Susan. It's wonderful to be with you on your show.
Glad to have you here. And the book that you wrote, I mean, it's a great book. I know you're getting wonderful testimonials about the quality of the leadership of it, but I was really drawn to it because the aviation component and your background. You're also the co-author of Find Your Why with Simon Sinek. Yeah. And you're here today to answer the question about, well, how do you give up control to become a better leader?
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Because it would be easy to think that leadership is all about retaining or increasing one's own power or control. But leading from the jump seat is very much about empowering others. It's about creating a space that they can step into and step up and lead and choose to take that role, and indeed carry forward those things that we feel are important to us. And the reason why I think it's really important to think that way is because, you know, it's inevitable. We will all hand over control at some stage. You know, if we're the CEO of a company, we will retire at some stage. If we are leading a team, chances are we'll flip over and lead another team. But, well, even if as a parent, you know, our children eventually grow up, leave home, and start to lead their own lives. So this is an inevitability. Leading from the jump seat is all about, well, how do we lead intentionally, moving towards that point where others pick up the lead and carry on when we've taken a step back? Because when we do that intentionally, if that's the context within which we lead, then the magic happens. And that magic means that our performance as a team right now starts to accelerate. It gets greater velocity. And also, we know that we're creating something for the future too.
Yeah. And again, going back to the aviation component, you have 25 years career in the Royal Air Force and lots of experience of leading. And then you've gone out and worked with Simon Sinek with his team. So you come with a very rich background. And not to use a common phrase in a different environment, but it's that rising tide lifts all ships, all boats. And like when we're lifting everybody up, then the organization is better, and you don't have to control things so much because other people are more empowered to do the things that you think egocentrically sometimes as a leader, that you're the only person that can do that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, you know, and this is one of the key themes in my book, Leading from the Jump Seat, it's if we are the person who's always got to be the one with the answer, you know, if we're the senior person and we think we've got to be the one with the answer, then we actually become the constriction in the pipe. We slow things down, yeah, and that's actually, we don't want to be too hard on ourselves because that's how we're trained. You know, if we think when we're at school, we start to specialize in things that are relatively early stage, those things that we're good at or we enjoy. We then go on to college and perhaps take a degree in that subject. You know, we become better at it. And then we go into the marketplace and chances are we're going to be hired because of that skill and expertise. But then after a while, if we're really good at it, what tends to happen is we get promoted and we're no longer doing that thing that we're skilled in. We're suddenly thrust into this position where we are leading or managing a team of people who are doing that thing. And we find that we can be actually very poorly equipped to take on that role. And so what do? We revert to what we know, which is we want to be the go-to person, the person with the answer, because that's how we've progressed up to that point. But then it limits how far and how quickly we progress. And Jumpseat leadership is about starting to get comfortable leading by actually not knowing the answer to the challenges we face. Because when we get really comfortable in that place, then what it's about, leadership is then about holding that context, painting the picture on the box of where we're going, rather than being the one who's got the answer of how to get there. And instead we turn to our team and empower them and say, look, this is where we got to be. Now bring your collective genius to bear and help us figure out how to get there. And that's where not knowing the answer becomes a great strength. And we accelerate our team much more quickly than we would if we're that constriction in the pipe, by being the only one who's got the answer.
I couldn't agree more. You know, while I did do a short time in corporate America with AT&T, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've jumped ship a couple times, you know, in different industries. And one of the times that it was actually when I left AT&T and I decided that I wanted to open a bakery cafe chain. I was running marathons. I'd go into these early morning meetings at AT&T and they'd have donuts, and I'd be like, oh, what I wouldn't give for a good bran muffin, you know, and it didn't exist at the time. So I did that. I knew nothing about the restaurant business. I knew nothing about the construction portion to get this, what used to be a shoe store, turned into a bakery cafe. And then the hiring process. And exactly what you were talking about, I had to go in with curiosity about learning, about asking people who were in the industry, asking people who came in to work for me, and put together a team where we collectively created what turned out to be a five location cafe chain. I had youngsters who were working for me that it was their first job. And I had people who had been in the restaurant industry for 20 or 30 years. And we just came together, and it was exactly what you're talking about with the magic. I didn't understand leading from the jump seat or the way that your leadership book has been laid out. And yet somehow that happened. And it truly makes a difference when you're willing to learn and everybody comes together and puts their best genius in one place.
Absolutely. And picking up on one of the points you made there, Susan, what I put in the book, a lot of it might not be new to people, but what I've done is to put into words and a process. It's a how-to book of how to lead from the jump seat. So all those things that you've mentioned, which perhaps were instinctive to you, by putting them into words, codifying them, if you will, it enables you to be more intentional about using those techniques. And I think I was very fortunate in the military, although I didn't realize it at the time. Two aspects of that. First, officer training. When you're trained as an officer, you know, you go through 6-9 months, whatever it is, of officer training, typically in your early 20s. When you then graduate, you're expected in the military to lead teams of people who are more experienced than you, both in terms of the job, but also in terms of their age. And yet you're the one in charge. And so you naturally, if you're going to thrive, you must naturally start to embrace the notion of being curious and asking people, because chances are you're not going to know the answer, but you're the one who's going to make the decision.
Yeah.
But what you do is you turn on your enlisted, not turn on, that's the wrong phrase, isn't it? But you turn to your enlisted people who've got the decades often of experience. And you ask the sergeants, the corporals, or the equivalent, you know, what do you see here? How do you see us progressing to overcome this challenge? And then you take their advice and then you make the decision. So that's one example from the military, which I think we can apply in business as well, you know, to get relaxed, to know that when you lead, even when you don't know the answer, it does actually work at scale. And the other thing, which I think I reflected on just the other day, when I was hired as a pilot in the Air Force, I couldn't fly. Think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
You know,
that's a head turner.
Yeah. How many employers would hire someone who does not have the skill to deliver what they're being hired for? And yet that's what the military did with me, and that's what the military does in the US Air Force, US Marine Corps, Navy, etc. They will hire people as pilots who do not have that qualification. But what they're focused on, particularly with the officer training, they're focused on making sure that person is going to fit culturally to the organization. Are the things that we as an organization feel are really, really important, do they resonate with this person that we're thinking of hiring? And officer training is as much about assessing that as it is about producing the officer at the end of the process, you know? And only when they're sure of that, because you can't change those things. You can't change the things that are deeply important to people, those things that drive us, you know, and there'll be several of those things, even if we can't articulate them. You can't change those. But if you can determine that the person you're thinking of hiring shares similar drivers to you, then provided they've got the basic competencies, you know, they check that I could walk in a straight line and pat my head and stir my tummy at the same time, you know, things like that. So there's a chance that I might be able to learn how to fly an airplane. Then they invested millions in training me to be a pilot.
Yeah.
But often we do it completely the other way around in business. We hire for the skill set, the computer programmer or marketeer or whatever, and then 6 months down the road, discover that they really don't fit because the things that are important to them are not the things that are important to us as a company.
Yeah. Talk about value assessments, right? Getting in touch with what your values are and hiring and leading from that place.
Yeah. Although I want to pick up on that too, because I talk about values in the book. Because values are something that we talk about a lot in business and in leadership. You know, values aren't as fixed as we might like to think they are. You know, I know that you are a caring and generous human being, Susan, just from our conversations before this podcast. And like me, I like to think I'm a kind and generous person. But hey, put us in a situation where you've got to file your tax return and it's the last date and you've got to get it into the shipping office, the mail or whatever the process is. And you're driving and it's just coming up to the closing time of the shipping office, the mail room. And you drive to the parking lot and there's one space left. And out the corner of your eye, you see someone who's also hunting for a parking space. And then you pretend you don't see them. And you park in that slot because you've got to get your thing in the mail. Now, you might feel bad about it.
Truth.
But
Yeah.
what in that moment has happened to your value of being generous and courteous and thinking of others? So, you know, values are contextually based. They can change or shift or morph in a moment depending on the context. So that's why in the book, I spend quite a lot of time going deeper than values. I talk about what are the non-negotiables, the deep drivers inside of us, which are part of our character and never shift. So examples of that, for me and for many people, it's family. Okay, that's one thing. When my wife, I got a call from her a couple of years ago, she'd been involved in a car accident. I dropped everything and went straight to help her. And I think that the value, the trick is to identify those things that create the same sort of energy inside of us. So other things for me that fall into that place of really powerful non-negotiable drivers, mutual respect. I think that is hugely powerful for me and a non-negotiable. And people who want to understand where that came from, you can read the story in the first few chapters of the book. But another one that is very clear for me is not being a burden on others and being self-sufficient and being in a place to help others too. And there is good life experiences that identify that as a non-negotiable for me. And when we identify these non-negotiables, these drivers, they then become or can become what I refer to as stands. which then can turn into commitments and action. And the reason that it's such a valuable well of energy is just like when I was given that, received that call from my wife saying that she'd been involved in a road traffic accident. I went to her aid. It was a couple of miles away. I had no idea what I was stepping into. It was completely the unknown. I was afraid, of course I was, but I stepped into that, fired up by this energy, this driver of family and my wife that was so important and still is to this day. And that had me step into the unknown. So when we take those drivers and put them in a business context, when we're looking at a climate as we have now, of great uncertainty, lots has changed. We feel that fear for our livelihoods quite often. When we can link back to those deeply held drivers and our stands, it can give us the handrail, it can give us the courage, it can give us the compass, if you like, to figure out what steps we need to take and for us to be able to move forward.
Yeah. From your website, I know that there are 3 practices. I've looked at your website and read your book, and commitment is the first one.
Absolutely.
So we'll talk about what the other 2 are in just a minute. But one of the things I'm hearing you say is it reminds me so much of the work when I'm hired to help somebody write, publish, and promote their book, is that sometimes it's surface level. So we'll just use the values. It's surface level. Yeah. But then we kind of go on this mining expedition to find what I call the golden thread, to find the golden nugget, the golden idea, which is much deeper and is underneath that. And that's where the gold lives. And your gold is where you went deeper than just values.
And I think just picking up on your great example of writing a book, you and I both can think of people, I'm sure, who we know say, yeah, I want to write a book, and you might even engage with them to support them. But you will have a feel of those who are really going to make it all the way through and those who probably don't. And that's where this word commitment comes in. And commitment, for me, I define commitment as a promise we make to ourselves. When it's in service of others, that's a really powerful commitment, but it boils down to the promise we make to ourselves. You know, I could make a commitment to you that I'm going to write and get a manuscript to you by October. But unless deep down I've made that promise to myself, I can find all sorts of excuses to offer to you if I don't come up with the goods by October. And that's even if we've got a contract and all the rest of it. It's about the promise we make to ourselves. And the way we make that promise, the way we make a commitment that holds true and holds firm, is when we link it back to what we stand for and our drivers that push us forward. So absolutely. Putting that into practice, if I made a commitment to you to deliver a manuscript by a certain date, then my principle of mutual respect would help drive me forward, because I wouldn't want to let you down, because that wouldn't be respecting your time and energy you put into this project. So that's why the commitment side of it is so important, and tracing back where commitment really comes from. You start with, well, it's a promise to oneself, but where does that promise get its strength from? And you track it all the way back to those non-negotiables, those drivers. And that process is so important because it supports us on a daily basis, but it supports us too when we're faced with the big unknown and the big scary bears that sometimes we come across in life.
Yeah, I call it the jet fuel. You know, another analogy into aviation, but it's what catapults you to the level. For messengers on a mission, for me, is I'm on a mission to get people like you more visible out into the world, because I believe so much in your work. When I'm working with my clients or somebody that I have met like you that's not a client, but I love the conversations that we have where I'm sharing what I know about publishing, and there are things that you wouldn't necessarily know because that's not your vein of gold, but it's shining that light for people who are a force for good in the world. And that's my jet fuel. that's the commitment, yes, but it's my jet fuel because I'm on a mission to do this. It's what gets me up in the morning. It's what makes me reach out and make connections with people like you, to take the time to do this interview, to share with other people. And if you just say, oh, I'd like to do this, or wouldn't it be nice to do that, or gee, it would be good to do that, that's so surface level, because you really have to go deep.
Yeah, I agree. I would say, though, as well, just to balance this a little bit, another point I make in the book, which we don't often hear, is don't be too hard on ourselves. Everything I've just said about commitment stands, but sometimes, we trip up, we make a mistake, we miss something, and we can beat ourselves up around that. But you know what? Those individual moments where we do slip up, they don't actually matter that much on the basis of two conditions. One, where are we sourcing ourselves from? What's our intent? Is our intent to move forward in that positive way? Is our intent sourced from a place of fear? Or is it sourced from a place of love for something? And obviously it's the latter that we really want. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it's not about those individual data points, it's about the trend. If in very general terms, if most of us would like to think that we live a good and generous life, but occasionally, we'll take that parking slot, perhaps, and we think afterwards, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That was selfish. Well, don't beat yourself up about it. If your overall trend in life is heading in the direction that you would like it to head, in service, ideally, of others, then that's okay. So trends and intention are so much more important than single data points where we make a mistake, we trip up, and we have to pick ourselves up and move forward.
Yeah, negative self-talk doesn't serve anybody. It's only going to bring your energy level down. So be kind to yourself, be generous with yourself, and be loving with yourself.
Totally, which doesn't mean to say that you're always going easy on yourself either. There is a balance, but don't beat yourself up when you don't always get it right.
So let's talk about the second practice, which is humble confidence.
Actually, it links to something I just mentioned around fear and love, and it builds on the commitment piece. And that's this: everything that we do in life that's important to us, everything is sourced from one or two places. It's either sourced from fear or it's sourced from love. And anyone listening to this, you think about the things that are really deeply important to you, and you can put them in one of those two buckets, fear or love. And mostly, I'm glad to say, for most people, we're source ourselves from a place of love. But fear can arise in a number of circumstances. Fear arises when we sense that our life is in danger. And that's okay. That will help us to step out of the way physically of danger. Jumping back from a car that's running down the road, it saves our life, and that's good. But in business and in life generally, fear can actually arise in three other circumstances too. And that's when we sense that our livelihood, our reputation, or our status is threatened. And when fear arises because of those three things, then generally it does not serve us well, because fear then shows up as, well, our view of the world closes down from a place of opportunity. We see the world as a place of scarcity. We see it as a binary win-lose, and we've got to win and everybody else has got to lose. We start to focus on ourself, ego. That's what ego means in Greek, I. And we close down thinking about other people. It can show up as anger, or it can show up at the other end of the scale as meekness. We withdraw. And none of these things help us when we're either leading a team or indeed leading ourselves. But the good news is we always have a choice. And we can choose instead to see fear as a warning flag in these circumstances and choose love and to be sourced from love. Now, people get twitchy in business when I talk about love, but
I'm sure they
what
do.
love looks like in business is we see the world as a place of opportunity and possibility. We see the world as a place where we can serve others rather than just focusing on ourselves. And importantly, instead of ego, we lead with humble confidence. And humble confidence is sourced from love because we are very much focused on the trajectory, where we're going. We're resolute on where we want to be and what we want to accomplish. But at the same time, we have the humility to listen to others. And this links directly back to where we're talking about leading when we don't know the answer and linking into the collective genius of our team. We can only do that if we have humble confidence, where we are ready to make the decision when the time comes, and yet we have the humility to tap into the expertise of our team and what other people see. So that's why humble confidence is so important. Now, fear and love, what connects them is courage. Fear can't, or courage, well, there you are. There we go. Sign on the back. But courage cannot exist without fear, but it can only be sustained by the love for something. And that courage goes all the way back to what drives us, our stands, those non-negotiables. That's where courage comes from. So that is the reason it's so important to start, and why the book starts, at getting deeply into what's really important to you in life, non-negotiables, because then that will give you the courage to overcome fear when your livelihood, status, or reputation is under threat, and choose love and humble confidence to lead instead. And that is what's going to move you forward, not leading with ego from a place of fear.
Love that. Now, there's a third practice, and we will talk about that in a minute. But there's a story in your book that I'm very familiar with, and I was excited to see your explanation, your take on it. And I've studied this particular situation, and it's the worst aviation disaster in history at Tenerife. Is that the way you say that island?
Well, I don't do Spanish Tenerife, but Tenerife Norte, but Tenerife Airport.
Yeah. It was 1977 when two Boeing 747 passenger jets collided. And it's the deadliest accident. There were almost 600 people that died. And anybody that wants to research it is interested in aviation. It's a fascinating story, and it comes for the lack, in my opinion, of clear communications and this ego that we're talking about. And if the radio communicator, because communications, and I know this from traveling around the world, that sometimes it's very hard when you're in a foreign country to understand the air traffic controllers. And so you have to be, it's important with whatever role you're playing and getting that plane in the air safely and landed at its destination with passengers, and doing it in a safe and successful fashion, is that you have to have clear communications. So why don't you tell the story about what happened?
Absolutely. So this happened 29th of March, 1977 at Tenerife Airport. And fog descended at the time at this very busy airport. And a KLM 747 with the captain by the name of Jacob van Zanten, they were taxied and ready for takeoff to get airborne to go to a neighboring island. Very sadly, a Pan American 747 was still on the runway. They were trying to clear the runway to taxi to their parking slot. But because of the fog, they couldn't be seen. And because of the poor radio communication, that message didn't get through, that it was still on the runway. And so what happened was the KLM aircraft, Captain Jacob van Zanten, they started their takeoff roll, and they hit the Pan Am 747 about 3/4 of the way down the runway. And as you say, 583 people lost their lives that day. So what caused that? Now, there was a lengthy investigation, but pick up on some of the points you raised there, Susan. First was communication. Communication, there's two ends to it. There's the transmit and there's the receive.
Exactly.
And this applies in everyday life and business as much as it does on an aeroplane. It's about making sure you transmit a clear message, but also you need to make sure it's being received. And back in 1977, the procedures around the words, the vocabulary that was used for certain instructions was not as clear as it is today. And this is one of the things that came out of that accident. The procedures, the language used for communication between air traffic control and aircraft was tidied up to make sure that a message was not only transmitted, but it was received and understood at the other end. So in this particular case, the KLM aircraft ready for takeoff, air traffic control transmitted a message, but it didn't get through clearly to the KLM flight deck crew. And there was a belief by that crew that they'd probably been given clearance to take off. So they started the takeoff roll. So that was the first thing, communication. But the other thing which taps into the ego side that you mentioned was Captain Jacob van Zanten of the KLM aircraft. He was the most senior pilot in the airline. He was what's known as a senior training captain. He trained other pilots, but also he was quite literally the poster pilot for KLM. His face appeared on all of their advertising posters everywhere in their flight magazines. He was, the face of the airline. What that meant on the flight deck was that the other two crew members, the first officer and the air engineer, they kind of looked up to him.
Mm-hmm.
He was almost God in the company terms. And it was very difficult for them to challenge his view. And so when they were ready for takeoff, the captain, Van Zanten, said, "We're going." He pushed the throttles forward. And the air engineer kind of questioned a little bit, but didn't follow through. And neither did the first officer. So he wasn't challenged around, do we have clearance to take off? And if one of them had challenged the captain and checked with air traffic control, the accident may never have happened.
Exactly.
And this was put down to perhaps the ego of the captain. He knew what he was doing. And what we call the cockpit gradient. And we have this in business as well. i.e. the seniority of someone in the company is so high compared to the junior person who's got a view. The gradient, it's so steep between them that the junior person will not speak up. Now, if Captain Van Zanten had humble confidence and was willing to listen to his crew again, things may have turned out differently. Now, there is one good thing that came out of that, perhaps two. One was the communication procedures on the radio, but also it led to something which is known as crew resource management, CRM for short. And this was a direct result of the findings from that accident. And since the early 80s, it started with United Airlines, but the early 80s, all professional crew members have been trained in what's called crew resource management, CRM. And this is a culture where the most junior pilot feels empowered to speak up to the most senior pilots. And I was trained in this too. And towards the end of my flying career, I was a very senior guy, both in terms of flying and also the rank I held in the military. And whenever I climbed onto the flight deck of our aircraft, I'd turn to the really junior pilots I often flew with and said, look, your job is to watch me and catch me out. If I make a mistake or say something that you think is incorrect, your job is to speak up. You got it? And I made it very clear that they were empowered to do that. And of course, two things happen. One is, first of all, there's a good chance that you then don't miss things, but also you're empowering that other person. You are lifting them up. You're giving them a voice. And that is hugely powerful.
Yeah, and that only happens if there's open communications and humble confidence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, humble confidence. Humble confidence is the thing. Ego needs to be left behind. And there are some other great stories in my book, I think, where things have happened to me, being faced with crash landing an aircraft with 140 people on board, where the captain at the time, I was the first officer, but the captain at the time showed superb humble confidence, which in large part led to the great outcome of that situation.
Yeah, you have great stories. Like, we're not going to have time to go over all of them, but you've just got great stories that support the points that you're making. And in your book also, you break it down into 3 different ways, depending upon where you are in your journey of leadership, what you can garner, so that whether you're a starting leader, mid-level management leader, CEO, business owner, because that's typically what I work with, is a entrepreneur, business owner. And, so there's levels of which you can take the points made in your book and apply them.
Yes, and I'll just quickly mention there's actually 4 levels. There's learning to fly, flying, teaching others to fly, and then leading from the jump seat. And so it's carrying the metaphor over from flying, but it applies totally in business. So very quickly, learning to fly is when we're trying to figure out what's really important to us. So for many, that will be typically perhaps when you go to college, or if you choose a different direction, you're figuring out what are those non-negotiables. And then you move on to the next stage, which I call flying, which could be, if you're a pilot, you're literally flying the airplane. But if you're a computer programmer, you're good at your job. You've got that job where you're a software engineer, and you're great at it. You're flying. But then you'll get promoted, perhaps. And that's when you start to teach others to fly, because now you've got a team, and your job is to lift them up and to help them to fly better. But then later on in your career, you'll move to that place where you're starting to take a step back. And that's when you're leading from the jump seat. And you're thinking about how you can leave your organization or your team in a really great place so they can carry forward those things that you feel are deeply important to you. And here's the great thing, which I love about those 4 stages. We can be at different stages in different areas of our life. So here's an example. One of the guys I mentioned in the book, a great leader I had the privilege of working alongside, Lieutenant General Sir James Dutton, KCB, CBE. He's been knighted twice by Her Majesty the Queen. You're lucky to get knighted once, but twice. Fantastic leader, led British and American forces in Iraq in 2003. He is a magnificent guy. And it's been my great privilege to get together with him again after 20 plus years. And he still hasn't changed. He's still the great leader I remember him to be. But here's the thing, he is now long since retired. He's long since past that point of leading from the jump seat. He's handed over control completely. But now he's learning how to fly again. And what learning how to fly looks like for him is what he's going to do in his retirement.
Yes.
He's got to figure that out. Yeah. And we don't have to wait to when we retire. It can be, we can be flying in our job or teaching others to fly in our day job, but then maybe we've taken up scuba diving or mountaineering, and we're right back down to learn how to fly again. Yeah. So at the end of each chapter in the book, to your point, I break it down into things that we can do to put the ideas in that chapter into practice, regardless of what stage we're at in our life or what area of our life we're looking at.
Yeah. Well, you know that my, if you call it tagline, is that I help people write the book that they'll be remembered for. And so often what you just described for him is the person that I work with, where they have so much rich knowledge. They don't want to really be in the jump seat. They don't really want to be, in the daily, day-to-day to-dos, but they have so much information and knowledge and share experiences that they want to share it with the world. And that's where I come in often and help them write the book that they'll be remembered for. And they love it because it is a new place for them to fly.
Yeah.
A much younger person than maybe what people are visualizing is a client of mine that's been on an interview here at Messengers on a Mission. And he had built a very, very successful real estate ownership business. He was pretty much hands off, had a management company that was renting and leasing and maintaining the buildings. And he had a level of wealth that he could learn how to fly. He was always a great passenger when I had my Cessna 182 because he was willing to fly with me. But he got to fly, and he just zoomed right up through the different levels. He now owns a Turbo Commander that he flew pole to pole 2 years ago with a documentary team following him around. But he changed. He literally learned to fly and go into a whole new industry. He's a thought leader in the aviation industry after like 6 or 7 years of completely recreating himself. So that reinvention that happens when people are willing to learn how to fly again, there's a lot of magic there.
Oh, there is. And I think I'd sum it up in one word, which is curiosity. Stay curious. If we're curious about life and about people, that means that we're willing to learn. We're willing to see different ways of doing things. And regardless of what we're doing, whether it is leading a company as a CEO, stepping back, looking at retirement, or just another story in my book, literally sweeping the floors of a workshop. If we remain curious about how others might do this, how we might do it better, what they see that we don't currently see, then we're always going to learn, and life is always going to be interesting, and it's going to make us a better leader too.
Yes, absolutely. And as an entrepreneur, we wear so many hats. Like we're talking about in a corporate environment, we have the structure, and people move up within the structure. But as an entrepreneur, we're wearing all the different hats. And there's so many different things. We were talking about it before we pressed the record button this morning. And so there's so much to be garnered for the entrepreneur in your book, as well as for the CEO and for the person who's just, as you were talking about, starting their career. So, absolutely. Peter, if I were going to ask you what your main message is without using the words leading from the jump seat, what do you believe in your heart of hearts? What is your shining light, your stake in the ground, what you want people to know the message is that you're on a mission to share? What would that be?
Well, I would say it's to lift others up so as they can be extraordinary. The one thing that really quite literally brings a lump to my throat is when I see people excelling in whatever it is that's extraordinary for them. So, something that's extraordinary for one person might be routine for you or I, but for them, they've overcome so much to accomplish that. And that's what brings a lump to my throat. I'm hopeless watching something like the Olympics. I really am. I don't know those sports people from Adam and Eve usually, but when I see them cross the line or accomplish something I know they've worked years on refining and getting better, I can't speak. I'm hopeless. I'm all choked up. So, that's, I think, is where I am right now. And what it means for the people I work with immediately around me on my team, I'm focused on lifting them up so they can thrive. And when I'm focused on that, I know that we're going to rise up together, just like the ships that you mentioned with the rising tide.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that you believe that everybody can accomplish extraordinary things. And that chokes me up because we're capable of doing so much more than sometimes we believe that we can. So having people like you in the world who are lifting others up and showing them that they can learn more, that they can do more, that they can be curious about more. Boy, that's living life, isn't it?
It is. And someone's just come into my mind. I haven't shared this before, but I'd like to now. Someone that really inspired me when I was growing up, when I was young, well, from the age of probably 5 until at least 14 or 16, was someone that my mother used to help look after. My mother was what was called a home help back then, but now it's called domiciliary care. And there was this remarkable lady called Muriel. And Muriel was set to be Olympic swimmer, in fact. But then at the age of 16, she caught polio. This goes back some years. And so from the time when I met her, she was bedridden. But she was such a remarkable human being. And now what would look extraordinary to her was, in fact, be able to get out of, get out of the bed with assistance in a wheelchair and go on holiday and vacation for a few days. That was a tremendous strain on her to get there, but it was extraordinary. And then she was the light and life of the room. She was a wonderful human being. And she was married to a guy called Frank. And Frank was involved in the Second World War, and that had given him lasting condition of arthritis, and it was very difficult for him to walk around. But that didn't hold him back. He was a very successful businessman. He was a character who was larger than life, and he was truly extraordinary. And both he and Muriel inspired me at an early age. So whatever extraordinary means to us, whatever it means to others, it can be big or large, but in that person's eyes, it's a big thing. And when they accomplish it, when they fulfill their potential, when they affect other human beings on this planet through who they're being, what they say and what they do, then that's being extraordinary.
I love that.
That's what lifts me up.
Yeah, because Muriel and her husband were just being who they are, shining lights in the world.
Absolutely.
And not by being an Olympic swimmer because it wasn't capable. She couldn't do that, but she could be a good person in the world.
Absolutely. And that's what inspires me. So even if we're bedridden, unable to move, we can be the pebble in the pond for someone else and cause those ripples to flow out far, far wider than we could ever imagine. That's the possibility that's there for each and every one of us.
Yeah. That's so beautiful, Peter. Thank you so much for being here today. And for anyone who's listening to this, I know that you've learned a lot, and you're going to go out and get leading from the jump seat, because there's so many wonderful points and stories in here. And for anyone who's watching, there's other great interviews of messengers on a mission. Please subscribe. Stay tuned for more. And Peter, I know this is just the beginning of a really beautiful journey for you.
Thank you, Susan. It's been an absolute delight and pleasure to spend some time with you today. Thank you.